You keep waiting to feel ready. That's your first mistake. You think discipline shows up when motivation shows up. Wrong. That's loser logic. Motivation is a mood. Discipline is a decision. And if your life's built on moods, then you're not in control. Your emotions are. That means you're weak, predictable, and easy to beat. The world doesn't reward people who feel like it. It rewards people who execute when they don't. Let me make this uncomfortable for you. Every time you say, I'm not feeling it today, what you're really saying is, I'm not in charge of my own mind. You've outsourced your power to something as unstable as a feeling. That's embarrassing. You don't need motivation. You need structure. You need standards. You need a version of yourself that operates like a machine, cold, precise, and consistent regardless of how you feel. Now, here's where most people get confused, and this is where you start separating yourself from the average man. Speaking in tongues isn't some mystical nonsense. It's a shift in internal language. It's when your inner voice stops sounding like a scared civilian and starts sounding like a commander. Most people wake up and their mind says, I'm tired, maybe later, take it easy. That's weakness speaking. That's the language of comfort, and comfort is a trap. But when you step into control, your internal language changes. It becomes sharp, direct, ruthless. Get up, move, execute. No negotiation, no debate. That's your version of speaking in tongues, rewiring your internal dialogue into something powerful, something dominant. You stop asking yourself for permission and start giving yourself orders. And once that switch flips, everything changes. Discipline without motivation looks boring from the outside, but it's deadly effective. It's waking up at the same time every day whether you slept well or not. It's training when your body is sore. It's working when your brain is foggy. It's doing the reps when nobody is watching and nobody is clapping. Because you're not doing it for applause. You're doing it because that's who you are now. Identity is the real game. Weak men try to act disciplined. Strong men become disciplined. You don't try to work hard. You are the man who works hard. You don't try to stay focused. You are the man who doesn't break focus. There's no decision left, no emotional interference, just execution. That's power. That's control. And let's be honest, most people will never reach this level. Why? Because it's uncomfortable. It requires you to kill your old habits, your excuses, your soft mindset. It requires you to become someone unrecognizable to your past self. Most people would rather stay average than go through that transformation. They'd rather talk about goals than become the man who achieves them. So here's the truth you don't want to hear but need to accept. Motivation is for amateurs. Discipline is for professionals. If you only move when you feel like it, you'll stay exactly where you are, stuck, frustrated, and replaceable. But if you learn to operate without motivation, if you learn to command your mind instead of listening to it, you become dangerous. You keep telling yourself you're waiting for motivation, but that's not the truth. It's a convenient excuse. The reality is much harsher. You've trained yourself to only act when it feels good, and that's a dangerous habit. Because feelings are unstable, unreliable, and completely unfit to lead a man who claims he wants control over his life. If your actions depend on how you feel, then your progress will always be inconsistent. An inconsistent effort guarantees mediocre results. Look closely at your own patterns. The days you feel energized, you push hard, you think big, you convince yourself you're finally changing. Then the next day, the energy disappears, and suddenly everything feels heavier. The same tasks now feel like a burden, so you slow down. You delay, you negotiate with yourself. That cycle repeats until weeks pass and nothing meaningful has changed. That's not bad luck. That's a system failure. You've built a system where emotions dictate performance, and emotions are the weakest foundation you could possibly choose. High-level individuals don't operate like this. They don't ask themselves whether they feel like doing the work. That question doesn't even exist in their internal dialogue. The task is there, so it gets done. Simple, clean, non-negotiable. That's the difference between someone who progresses and someone who stays stuck. One relies on mood, the other relies on standards. Standards don't fluctuate. Standards don't care if you're tired, distracted, or bored. Standards demand execution regardless of circumstances. You've been conditioned to believe that motivation is required to start. That's backwards. Action creates motivation, not the other way around. Waiting to feel ready is like waiting for the wind to change direction before you start walking. You'll stand still forever. Movement generates momentum. Once you begin, your mind catches up. But if you never begin, you stay trapped in overthinking, hesitation, and self-doubt. And that's exactly where most people spend their lives thinking about doing instead of actually doing. There's also an uncomfortable truth you need to confront. Depending on motivation as a form of avoidance, it allows you to justify inaction without admitting weakness. You can say, I'll do it when I feel motivated, instead of saying, I lack discipline. One sounds acceptable, the other exposes the problem. But if you're serious about growth, you don't get to hide behind acceptable language. You face the real issue directly. You accept that your current approach is flawed, and you replace it with something stronger. What replaces it is structure and non-negotiable rules. You decide in advance what gets done and when, and then you execute regardless of how you feel in that moment. No internal debate, no emotional check-in. You remove the option to opt out, because the moment you allow yourself to negotiate, you've already lost control. Your mind will always find a reason to take the easier path. That's its default setting. If you don't override it with discipline, it will override you with comfort. This is where most people break, not because the work is too hard, but because they're addicted to ease. They've spent years reinforcing the habit of stopping when things feel uncomfortable. So when discipline demands consistency, it feels unnatural, even painful. But that discomfort is not a signal to stop. It's proof that you're finally operating outside your old patterns. It's evidence that you're moving in the right direction. The shift happens when you stop asking, do I feel like it? And start asking, is it required? That single change removes emotion from the equation and replaces it with responsibility. And responsibility is far more stable than motivation. When something is required, you do it. No drama, no hesitation, just execution. You don't need more inspiration. You need a higher standard for your own behavior. Because once your standards rise, your excuses lose their power. And when excuses lose their power, your actions finally become consistent. That's where real progress begins. Not in bursts of motivation, but in relentless, disciplined execution that doesn't depend on how you feel. Most people don't realize they're being controlled because the voice controlling them sounds like their own. That's the trap. The same mind that should be your greatest weapon becomes your biggest liability when it's left unchecked. It whispers comfort, suggests delay, rationalizes weakness, and you obey it without question. You call it thinking, but in reality, it's conditioning. Years of choosing ease over effort have trained your mind to prioritize comfort above everything else. And now, every time you try to step up, that voice pushes you back down. Pay attention to what happens the moment you face resistance. The task gets difficult, and instantly your mind starts negotiating. Take a break. Do it later. You deserve rest. It sounds reasonable. It sounds logical. That's why it's dangerous. Weak thinking doesn't show up as obvious failure. It shows up as justified delay. And every time you listen to it, you reinforce the pattern. You're not just skipping a task. You're teaching your brain that it's in charge, that your actions are optional, that discipline is flexible. That's a losing position. Because if your mind is leading you, and your mind is wired for comfort, then your entire life will move in the direction of least resistance. And the direction of least resistance never leads to power, control, or success. It leads to stagnation. Average results. Missed potential. The frustrating reality of knowing you could do more, but never actually doing it. Control starts when you flip the hierarchy. Your mind is no longer the leader. It becomes the tool. And tools don't make decisions. They execute commands. That means you stop listening to every thought as if it deserves attention. You start filtering. You start questioning. You recognize that not every thought is useful, and most of them are designed to keep you safe, not strong. The shift is simple, but not easy. Instead of reacting to your thoughts, you start directing them. When your mind says, I don't feel like it, you don't argue. You override. When it suggests delay, you remove the option. You act immediately. No hesitation. Because hesitation is where weakness grows. The longer you sit with a thought, the more power it gains. Decisive action cuts that process off instantly. This requires a level of self-authority most people never develop. It means you become the one giving orders, not the one asking for permission. Your internal dialogue changes completely. It becomes structured, intentional, and aligned with your goals. You don't entertain distractions. You don't indulge doubt. You issue commands and follow through. That's what control looks like in real time. There's a critical detail most people miss. Taking control of your mind doesn't mean eliminating negative thoughts. That's unrealistic. Those thoughts will always exist. The difference is they no longer influence your behavior. You can feel resistance and still act. You can experience doubt and still execute. That's real strength, the ability to move forward without needing perfect mental conditions. Understand this clearly. Your first instinct is usually wrong. It's shaped by comfort, habit, and avoidance. If you follow it blindly, you'll stay exactly where you are. Growth begins when you stop trusting your immediate reactions and start relying on deliberate decisions. Decisions based on standards, not feelings. Decisions that move you forward, not keep you safe. The more you practice this, the stronger your control becomes. At first, it feels forced, unnatural. You'll catch yourself slipping back into old patterns. That's expected. But every time you override that instinct and act anyway, you're rewiring your behavior. You're proving to yourself that you're in charge. And that proof builds confidence, not the fragile kind based on mood, but the solid kind based on evidence. Eventually, something changes. The voice that once held you back starts to lose its influence. It becomes quieter, weaker, irrelevant, not because it disappeared, but because you stopped obeying it. And once you reach that point, you're no longer reacting to life. You're directing it. You keep telling yourself you're trying to be disciplined, but that phrase alone exposes the problem. Trying is unstable. Trying is temporary. Trying leaves room for failure because it assumes there's an option not to follow through. When you say you're trying, you've already given yourself permission to quit the moment it gets uncomfortable. That's not discipline. That's hesitation disguised as effort. Real discipline doesn't come from effort. It comes from identity. The moment you decide that something is part of who you are, the internal conflict disappears. There's no debate, no resistance, no need for motivation. It becomes automatic. You don't wake up and ask yourself if you feel like brushing your teeth. You do it because it's part of your identity. That same level of certainty has to apply to your work, your training, your habits. If it doesn't, then you're still operating at a surface level. This is where most people fail. They focus on actions without upgrading identity. They build routines, set goals, create plans, but deep down they still see themselves as inconsistent, undisciplined, or easily distracted. And that internal image always wins. You can't outperform your self-perception for long. Eventually, your behavior will align with what you believe you are. If you see yourself as someone who struggles, you'll continue to struggle no matter how many systems you put in place. The shift is brutal because it requires you to let go of your old identity completely. Not adjust it, not improve it, replace it. You stop seeing yourself as someone who is working on discipline and start seeing yourself as someone who doesn't break standards. That's a different level of thinking. It removes negotiation entirely. When a standard is set, it's followed, not because it's easy, but because breaking it is no longer an option. This is where discipline becomes effortless, not because the work is easy, but because the decision is already made. You don't waste energy thinking about whether you should act. That question has already been answered by the identity you've chosen. You simply execute, and that saves massive amounts of mental energy. Most people are exhausted not because they work hard, but because they constantly argue with themselves about whether to work at all. Look at the difference. A man who relies on effort wakes up and negotiates, should I go to the gym? Maybe later, maybe tomorrow. A man who operates from identity doesn't ask. He goes, the action is locked in before the day even starts. That's why identity-based discipline is so powerful. It eliminates hesitation at the source. There's also a level of accountability that comes with this shift. When discipline is tied to identity, every action becomes a reflection of who you are. Skipping a task isn't just a missed opportunity, it's a violation of your own standard. And when you take your identity seriously, those violations become unacceptable. You don't need external pressure, reminders, or motivation. Your own standards become the pressure. This doesn't mean it feels good. It often doesn't. You'll still experience resistance, fatigue, and frustration. But those feelings don't influence your behavior anymore, because your behavior is no longer based on how you feel. It's based on who you are. And who you are doesn't change from day to day. It's fixed, stable, reliable. The danger is that most people underestimate how serious this shift needs to be. They treat identity like a label instead of a commitment. They say, I'm disciplined, but their actions don't reflect it. That's not identity, that's wishful thinking. Real identity is proven through consistency, through repetition, through doing the same thing over and over again until it becomes undeniable. Once that identity is established, everything else follows. Decisions become faster, actions become sharper, results become predictable. because you're no longer operating randomly. You're operating as a defined individual with clear standards and non-negotiable behaviors. And that level of clarity is what separates controlled individuals from those who are constantly drifting. At that point, discipline stops feeling like something you have to force. It becomes something you embody. And when you embody it, there's no off switch. You say you want control, power, results, but your daily decisions say something completely different. You choose comfort at every opportunity, then wonder why nothing changes. That contradiction is the problem. You can't build a dominant life on comfortable choices. It doesn't work like that. Comfort and growth move in opposite directions, and every time you pick the easier option, you're stepping further away from the version of yourself you claim you want to become. Comfort is seductive because it feels harmless. Skipping one session, delaying one task, taking it easy just this once, none of it seems like a big deal in the moment. But that's exactly how it traps you. It operates in small, acceptable decisions that slowly reshape your standards. What used to feel like discipline starts to feel optional. What used to be non-negotiable becomes flexible. And before you realize it, your entire structure collapses into inconsistency. Look at the pattern closely. The moment something becomes difficult, your instinct is to reduce the pressure. You tell yourself you'll come back stronger tomorrow. But tomorrow never carries the same urgency. The intensity fades, the excuses grow, and the cycle repeats. That's how comfort weakens you, not through one major failure, but through repeated small compromises that lower your tolerance for discomfort. Here's the part most people refuse to accept. Discomfort is not a problem to avoid, it's a requirement to embrace. Every level of progress demands a higher tolerance for pressure, fatigue, and resistance. If you're constantly trying to minimize those things, you're also minimizing your potential. You don't get stronger by staying in conditions that feel easy. You get stronger by exposing yourself to situations that force adaptation. There's a psychological shift that needs to happen. Instead of viewing discomfort as something negative, you start seeing it as a signal that you're operating outside your comfort zone, a signal that you're challenging your current limits, a signal that growth is happening. When you reframe it like that, discomfort stops being something you run from and becomes something you actively seek. Most people never reach this point because they're addicted to ease. They've built their entire lifestyle around avoiding stress, avoiding pressure, avoiding anything that feels too demanding. And over time, that avoidance lowers their capacity. Tasks that should be manageable start to feel overwhelming. Challenges that should be normal start to feel impossible. Not because they are, but because the individual has trained themselves to operate at a lower threshold. This is why discipline feels so hard in the beginning. You're not just building new habits. You're rebuilding your tolerance for discomfort. You're forcing yourself to stay in situations your mind has been trained to escape. And your mind will resist. It will push back with excuses, distractions, and rationalizations. That's expected. It's trying to protect the comfort it's used to. The mistake is thinking that resistance means you should stop. It doesn't. It means you're exactly where you need to be. Every time you stay in that uncomfortable state and continue to act, you're expanding your capacity. You're proving to yourself that you can handle more than you thought. And that proof changes your baseline. What once felt difficult starts to feel normal. There's also a level of respect you build for yourself when you consistently choose discomfort over ease. Not surface-level confidence, but real internal respect. Because you know you're doing what others avoid. You know you're holding a higher standard, and that creates a different kind of presence, one that isn't dependent on external validation. Comfort will always be available. It's the default option. It requires no effort, no discipline, no control. That's why most people stay there. But if you stay there too, you're choosing the same results they get: average performance, limited growth, and constant frustration. The moment you stop prioritizing comfort and start prioritizing progress, everything shifts. Your decisions become sharper, your actions become more consistent, and your tolerance for pressure increases to a level most people never reach. You've been taught to admire intensity, big bursts of effort, extreme focus for a short period, pushing hard until you burn out and then disappearing for days. It looks impressive from the outside, but it's one of the most ineffective ways to operate. Because intensity without consistency is unstable. It creates spikes in performance, followed by long periods of inactivity, and those gaps destroy any real progress you could have made. Pay attention to your own behavior. When you feel motivated, you go all in. You overcommit, overload your schedule, push beyond your limits. For a moment, it feels like you've unlocked something powerful. But that level of intensity isn't sustainable. Your energy drops, your focus weakens, and suddenly you can't maintain the same pace, so you stop. Not because you're incapable, but because you built your approach on extremes instead of stability. This is where most people get it wrong. They think success comes from how hard you can push at your peak. It doesn't. It comes from how consistently you can show up when you're not at your best. That's the real test. Anyone can perform at 100% for a short period. Very few can operate at 60-70% every single day without interruption. And that's where the real advantage is built. Consistency doesn't feel exciting. It's repetitive, predictable, and often boring. You're doing the same actions at the same time with the same level of focus regardless of how you feel. There's no emotional high, no dramatic breakthrough moment, just steady execution. And because it lacks intensity, most people underestimate its power. They chase excitement instead of results. The truth is, consistency compounds. Small actions repeated daily create outcomes that intensity alone can't match. One controlled session every day will outperform 5 extreme sessions, followed by 10 days of nothing. Because progress isn't about isolated efforts. It's about accumulated work. Every day you show up, you're adding to that accumulation. Every day you skip, you're breaking the chain. There's also a mental shift that happens when you prioritize consistency. You stop thinking in terms of how much can I do today and start thinking in terms of how long can I sustain this. That changes everything. It forces you to operate within a structure that you can maintain indefinitely. Not just for a week, not just for a month, but long enough to see real transformation. This approach requires restraint. You have to hold back from going all out when you feel strong. You have to control your urge to overdo it, because overdoing it today often leads to underperforming tomorrow. And that imbalance slows you down more than it helps you. Discipline isn't just about pushing forward. It's about regulating your effort so you can keep moving without interruption. Most people fail here because they rely on emotion to drive performance. When they feel good, they push hard. When they don't, they do nothing. That creates inconsistency, and inconsistency keeps them stuck. The goal is to remove emotion from the equation entirely. You don't adjust your effort based on how you feel. You maintain a baseline that gets executed no matter what. There will be days when your energy is low, your focus is off, and everything feels harder than usual. Those are the days that matter most. Not because you'll perform at your highest level, but because you'll reinforce the habit of showing up. Even at 40%, even at 30%, you still execute. And that builds a level of reliability that intensity can never provide. Over time, this reliability becomes your advantage. While others are cycling through phases of high effort and complete inactivity, you're moving forward every single day. The gap starts small, almost unnoticeable. But as days turn into weeks and weeks into months, that gap becomes impossible to ignore. Not because you worked harder, but because you worked consistently. You don't need extreme effort. You need controlled, repeatable action that you can sustain without breaking. Because the man who shows up every day, regardless of how he feels, will always outperform the man who only shows up when he's at his best. You spend too much time thinking, planning, analyzing, and preparing, and almost no time actually doing. That's the uncomfortable truth. You convince yourself you're being productive because your mind is active, but activity is an achievement. You can sit for hours refining a plan, watching content, learning strategies, and still produce nothing. Because none of it matters until something is executed in the real world. There is a moment where thinking becomes a liability. Not because thinking is bad, but because you're using it as a substitute for action. You hide inside preparation because it feels safe. It gives you the illusion of progress without exposing you to risk. No failure, no judgment, no discomfort, but also no results. And deep down, you know that. You know the gap between what you plan and what you actually do. That gap is where your potential is being wasted. Execution is the only thing that closes that gap. It's the point where ideas stop being theoretical and start producing outcomes. It's where you test, adjust, improve, and move forward. Without execution, everything else is irrelevant. You could have the best strategy in the world, but if you don't act on it, it's worthless. Meanwhile, someone with a basic plan who executes relentlessly will outperform you every time. The problem is, execution requires exposure. The moment you act, you open yourself up to failure. Things might not work, you might make mistakes, you might look inexperienced, and that's exactly why most people avoid it. They prefer the comfort of potential over the risk of reality. Because potential is unlimited, you can imagine yourself succeeding without ever proving it. But execution forces you to confront where you actually stand. This is where you need to shift your perspective. Failure is not something to avoid, it's something to use. Every mistake gives you information. Every failed attempt shows you what doesn't work. That feedback is what allows you to refine your approach and improve. Without it, you stay stuck in theory, repeating the same ideas without ever evolving. There's also a speed factor most people ignore. The faster you execute, the faster you learn. The faster you learn, the faster you improve. And that creates momentum. While others are still thinking about their next move, you've already made 5 moves. Learn from them and adjust it. That speed compounds over time, creating a massive advantage. Hesitation is the biggest enemy of execution. The longer you wait, the more resistance builds. Doubt creeps in, distractions appear, and your initial intent weakens. What felt clear a few minutes ago starts to feel uncertain. That's why decisive action is critical. You act while the decision is fresh, before your mind has time to interfere. You don't give yourself space to overthink. This doesn't mean acting without direction. It means acting with enough clarity to move forward, even if everything isn't perfect. Waiting for perfect conditions is another form of delay. Conditions are rarely perfect. There will always be uncertainty, incomplete information, and variables you can't control. If you wait for everything to align, you'll never start. Execution also builds confidence in a way nothing else can. Not the fragile confidence that comes from motivation or external validation, but real confidence based on evidence. Every time you take action and follow through, you prove to yourself that you can rely on your own decisions. That proof accumulates, strengthening your self-trust. Most people are stuck in a loop of intention without action. They think about what they should do, talk about what they're going to do, and then delay doing it. Breaking that loop requires a simple but difficult rule. Once a decision is made, it gets executed immediately. No delay, no second guessing, no adjustment based on how you feel. At that point, your focus shifts entirely. You stop measuring yourself by what you plan and start measuring yourself by what you produce. Because in reality, that's the only metric that matters. And once you become dangerous, everything changes. You stop negotiating with weakness. You stop explaining yourself. You stop waiting. You move. You execute. You dominate. That's what discipline looks like without motivation. And if you can't handle that, then you're not built for the life you say you want.